Emirates along the Sahel belt of the continent. Now, what is interesting about this jihad is that at the helm were political and military leaders who also doubled as religious leaders. One of the most prominent being a man called Sheikh Usman Danfodio, also known as the leader of the faithful. I would like to argue that the present-day Islamist extremist groups and militias, such as we find in Somalia, in Nigeria, Niger, for example, appear as the political progeny of this jihad movement that sought to create a pan-Islamic political system across Africa, using violence to subjugate its enemies, suppress resistance, and impose a harsh Islamic penal code. Today, there is a deep and volatile religious fault line separating the predominantly Muslim North Africa from the predominantly Christian Southern or Sub-Saharan Africa. And between these two halves, there is what the recent study has called the Great Meeting Place. And it's a 4,000-mile stretch from Somalia in the east to Senegal in the west. And what is interesting is that the movements and shifts along this religious fault line, separating North and Sub-Saharan Africa, frequently erupts with devastating consequences. You think, for example, of terrorist strikes, like the bombing of the US embassies in Kenya and Tanzania in 1998. You think of sectarian violence, like the clashes in Nigeria recently, where hundreds of Muslims and Christians were killed, and bloody wars, including the protracted conflict between the Arab North Sudan and the Christian South Sudan. And so with regard to the question of how religion relates with politics in Africa, it is safe to conclude that integration rather than separation is the norm. Across much of the continent, politics remains the most fertile ground for staking competing claims for supremacy by the continent's two most dominant but also foreign religions, namely Christianity and Islam. The result is that many parts of Africa are still divided by religiously motivated tensions. Hence my preliminary conclusion that religion constitutes a significant factor of politics in Africa. Now, drawing on a variety of examples, I would like to illustrate the complexity that characterizes religion and politics in Africa, with particular reference to the Christian Church. On December 29, 1991, one of Africa's most corrupt leaders, former President Frederick T.J. Chiluba of Zambia, famously amended the country's constitution and declared Zambia a Christian nation. He based his argument or his decision on biblical evidence. Chiluba declared that, and I quote, "A nation is blessed whenever it enters into a covenant with God and obeys the word of God." End quote. He believed that the submission of Zambia to what he understood as divine rulership would result in the eradication of corruption and herald the advent of economic prosperity. But as president, Chiluba went on to set the worst record of economic decay massive poverty in Zambia to date. The Zambia Chiluba example reveals several interesting patterns and dimensions of the relationship between church and politics in Africa. For example, it shows how religion continues to be used as a faith leaf for camouflaging and securing approval for dubious policies, programs, and motives by political operators. Now, colonial sociological and anthropological studies have described Africans as inherently religious. Now, the continent's cast of Machiavellian politicians, they know this. And so, not infrequently, they would attempt to exploit the religious sensibilities of the people in view of narrow political objectives and interests. Another thing that comes out of the Zambian example is the church in Africa is a very fractious reality. At times of great political challenges, the search for a common voice has proved to be an elusive prospect. Oftentimes, while the mainline churches would question and even challenge patent political machinations, like the declaration of Zambia as a Christian nation, other churches would readily rally to supply biblical warrants, justifications, and rationales for questionable political programs and policies. And here I find the injunction of Jesus of Nazareth very apt to the tenuous situation of churches in Africa, vis-a-vis the challenges posed by the continent's political arrangement, where Jesus reminds us that any house divided against itself will not stand. There are Christian sects, different African instituted churches, that would shun politics as a dirty game when it's convenient to do so, and openly support tainted regimes when political expediency counsels such political flirtations. If we go to Nigeria, the example of this country reveals some more interesting dimensions of the fraught relationships between church and politics in Africa. On one level, the tension between Islam and Christianity is played out in the political arena. Church bodies and Islamic communities would readily engage in political issues where and when each one feels threatened by the perceived or real ascendancy or dominance of the other. Now, this tension would frequently erupt in open violence between adherents of both religions. I would argue that the underlying issue here is the quest for power as a prerequisite for guaranteed access to the country's immense economic resources. It is interesting to note that to forestall this kind of situation of tension, a country like Tanzania has adopted an unofficial system of a rotating presidency, whereby the nation's top office is held alternately by a Christian and a Muslim. The point I want to make here is that in many parts of Africa, the church's engagement in politics faces a formidable challenge from the competing claims and interests of Islam. And for political reasons, the relationship between both religions remains fraught by mutual suspicion. And let's stay with Islam for a moment. The relationship between Islam and politics in Africa is not devoid of tension, violence, and conflict either. Across North Africa, most of the political systems draw on the tenets of Islam, or at least claim to draw on the tenets of Islam.